You're listening to Writer Unblocked, a podcast for aspiring and experienced authors. I'm your host and author coach, Nicole, and on this show, we chat with up-and-coming as well as best-selling authors, literary agents, and publishing professionals to inspire you and keep the vibe high. Today on Writer Unblocked, I'm chatting with Liza Darnton. She's been in publishing for over 20 years, and her background includes in-house acquisitions editor for Penguin and Amazon Publishing, as well as an independent editor working directly with both professional and new authors. Liza is also an agent at large for Mary Evans Inc. You can find Liza on LinkedIn, and I will be sure to put additional information in the show notes. Okay, let's dive in. Obviously, thank you so much for being here, Liza, and joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
Really excited to talk to you today. But first, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yes. So I have been working in publishing for a long, long time, many years on sort of many different sides of the business. I started out, as many people do, as an assistant to an established editor at Penguin years ago. And I was lucky enough to be working directly with the publisher, Anne Godoff, of the Penguin Press, who was also, an acquiring editor. She's done that throughout her entire career. And so I was really just kind of thrown in working with some of the great authors and some of the kind of really the literary masters. And I still sort of can't believe that that's where I cut my teeth, was working with authors like, Ron Chernow, who wrote Alexander Hamilton, which, as we all know, became Hamilton, the Broadway musical. Yeah. And Michael Pollan, some of these iconic authors and iconic books. Michael Pollan's book, Omnivore's Dilemma, is a book that people still read. Zadie Smith, I was able to read and, read along with Anne on her manuscripts. Anne was her U.S. agent, her U.S. publisher, that is, and many other authors like that. So I kind of jumped in, had this incredible experience, and was really sort of raised at the Penguin Press. And then after that, I moved on and I started my own freelance business for a while, where I was working specifically mostly with people who are writing memoirs and nonfiction, but also some literary fiction and other kinds of fiction. And then I went back to being an in-house editor and moved to Seattle and worked for Amazon Publishing, which was a very different experience. And just kind of another side of the industry. Is primarily digital, and kind of the Amazon Publishing grew out of Amazon self-publishing, or KDP. It's not the same thing. Sometimes people think it is. It kind of grew out of that model, but it is more like a traditional publisher than a self-publishing, in that you get submissions from agents and you work with authors and so on. And so I was an in-house publisher there for many years. And then I moved back to New York and kind of reignited my own business, working with lots of different people, working with authors who were writing for the first time and just needed help kind of formulating their ideas. People who had entire manuscripts, but they'd sort of already run through all their friends and family and other beta readers, and now they wanted a more professional editor, or someone who had the experience of working at a publisher. And then I also worked with agents to kind of help them and their clients create queries and create proposals and polish up manuscripts, so that when they get sent off to publishers, they're sort of in kind of prime condition and good to go, which is, that's one of the trends in publishing, that a lot of the time now agents really want to have their clients' work ready to publish before they even send it out to publishers, where that used to not be true. It used to be that an editor was a little bit more willing and able to kind of spend the time to work with an author on a manuscript before they would be able to acquire them, knowing that they would have to do that.
That's interesting. So now it's sort of like agents try to get the manuscript already from the author, or before they send it over to the
Yeah.
publisher, completely edit it?
I think it's just, there's just so many more submissions now. There's so much more out there. It's just the theory that the more ready it is for immediate publication, the higher a chance that an editor who's got a stack this high will be able to, come up with a reason to pick that one over all the others.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense with the volume. And yeah, I tell authors, don't skimp on the editing.
Yes.
The editing process is so important. So this is great. Let's talk about exactly that. And we sort of already started. How has the role of an editor changed in the publishing industry with the availability now of self-publishing, especially, but just in general, just in the traditional publishing industries also?
Well, it's really interesting. I do think that, and I've heard other editors say this too, that even just 10 years ago, but certainly before that, editors were kind of a little bit more willing and more able to acquire books that they knew weren't ready. Maybe they thought, and some editors are still doing this, and some publishers are still able to do this. But on the whole, it's kind of, in general, the trend now is not working with an author on their material to make it ready for publication, which is kind of the traditional editor, my editor. You think of them as editing. That is still true, but now the kind of the acquisitions piece in a lot of places has taken precedence. So an editor is not only editing, that's now that job, sitting there with the pen, editing and working with the author, has kind of gotten progressively less and less of the job. And more of the job is to acquire and just sort of acquire and get ready to produce the book that's going to be the next big hit, hopefully, from the perspective of the editor.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
And I love this question. What are the most common issues you see in manuscripts that have come to you for editing?
Well, it's interesting. I specialize in memoir, and I get a lot of different kinds of nonfiction, and I get a lot of different kinds of memoir. And memoir is by far my favorite thing to edit. And it kind of always has been. And I find that, especially when I'm getting manuscripts from authors who this is their first piece of writing, because a lot of the time it is the sort of gateway into writing that people choose, especially nonfiction, because they're writing about themselves. They're writing about what they know in their lives. But I do notice that one of the things I say a lot of the time when I'm working with people who are writing their first memoir and possibly writing their first book is that it's really hard to figure out how to do this. But one of the goals and one of the things you work on it with an editor to figure out how to do is to find the right balance between sort of the forest and the trees. So part of what that means is you have to kind of zoom out enough from your own life to be able to understand what is interesting to somebody who doesn't know you and love you, to just an average reader somewhere in the world. What is interesting to include for a person like that? And what is interesting just because you're writing it and it's about you and it happened to you. So you naturally think it's interesting. And that's a really hard thing to parse out because it's not always clear. Sometimes a very small detail of your life can be relevant and interesting and impactful and resonant with a wider readership. So it's not, is it a big thing that happened or a small thing that happened? It's just, does it kind of tell the story? Does it contribute to the particular themes and slant and direction that I've already set up? So, it speaks to, what do you pick out of your whole life? What pieces do you bring in? What pieces do you leave out? And that's really this question. It's a process of figuring out what is interesting to you because it happened to you and what is going to be interesting to a wider readership. And that's where an editor can really help, because they come in with a completely outside perspective, and they're able to go through and just kind of note, I don't think you need this. Maybe you should expand on this. You haven't really explained this. And so that is one of the first, that's probably one of the biggest things that I do for people who are writing memoirs for the first time. It's kind of help them negotiate that forest trees issue.
I like that. Forest trees issue is the perfect way to describe it. Now, how do you deal with resistance from an author where changes clearly need to be made, but they're resistant to it?
That's one of the things that really changes with the role that I'm in. So I mentioned that I've been in different roles. I've, when I'm coming at it from an in-house editor perspective, and we've already bought the book, the publisher has bought the book, there are certain expectations, then I might have to be a little bit more, forceful isn't the right word, but I guess I'd have to be a little bit more, I don't know, adamant if I see something that I really think is going to be detrimental to the way the book is received. But when it comes to kind of a creative choice, I actually have never had a situation, or I've only very, very rarely in all my years doing this had a situation where there's like a creative argument or a creative clash, because usually the author knows, they know what they want to do. And if you have a reason, if you can explain your reasoning for why you think that choice isn't working, then often they can go fix whatever it was. It doesn't have to be to remove, that entire scene or whatever. They could just set it up earlier, and they want to know. Authors always want to know if something's working or not. So I've never had the experience where, I'm sort of saying like, you can't kill off that character. And they're saying, I want to kill off or whatever. It's kind of not like that. And interestingly, I work with a lot of international authors, and people whose work have been translated into English too. And so that can come up a lot there and then I'm just kind of saying, in English, your character comes off and reads a little bit maybe misogynistic in this paragraph. Is that your intention? And half the time they'll say, no, not at all. How do we fix that? And, if it is their intention, then we leave it. But it's important to ask the question. And that doesn't have to only happen in a translation. You can do that in anybody's work. Did you mean for the main character to not be likable in the scene? Is it important that they're not likable, for example? Or, so, and then you talk through that, and there's almost always a way to make it so that whatever your concern was is addressed in one way or another.
I see. Yeah, because usually, and maybe this is a little cliche, but I always see maybe in movies or when I read and media, like my editor, like people, you know what I mean? Like there's sort of this headbutting that's going on, or my editor's pinging me about this manuscript, and it sometimes seems to be portrayed as a almost contentious relationship.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know. It's interesting because I think it can be that way in some cases, but there's also something about that is you're sort of assuming that the editor knows what is going to work and what isn't going to work. And when you say work, what does that even mean? Are you talking about what is going to sell? Because that's really or what is going to work sort of creatively. And I mean, just to go back to what I was saying earlier, you have to think a little bit more along those lines of what is going to sell. And the truth is, you don't know half the time. You make your best guess, and and you think you've thought about it a lot, and you've noticed how other books do in similar situations. So you can make an educated guess as an editor, but nobody really knows how a book is going to be received or how a character is going to be received. But as an editor for an in-house, publishing house that has already bought the book, you do have to think more along those lines than when I'm just working with someone who just wants to write. They just want to create. They want it to be a creative process. They have a story that they just want to put on the page and that they want to shape. And, and they may or may not end up submitting it to an agent and then a publisher. And if they do, then all of those questions can be dealt with then in those circumstances, unless the author is saying me, make this as publishable as, possible as, I'll just work with them to make sure that it makes creative sense and not have to think too much about commercial viability, which, as I said, no one really knows anyway.
I know half the time we're all very shocked and surprised what climbs to the top. And so for an author who's just starting out, like if I was writing a book right now, what advice or what would you say is important in the beginning stages to make is there good advice in the beginning stages from an editor that you can absorb to make that whole process of writing and finishing a manuscript easier in any way?
I think it depends a little bit on where you are in the process. If you're struggling to get the story out, which a lot of people are, and then there's a role for coaching, a really important role for coaching, and also for just kind of noticing your own process. So the first thing you have to have is you have to have words on the page. Without that, you kind of can't do anything, no matter what your idea is, no matter how good it is. You have to have the words on the page, and that's when you begin. So,
wait, are you saying you can't edit a blank page? Is that what you're saying?
The enemy is the blank page. I think if that's the only enemy in writing, and if you're going to put something on a sticky note, you can put that. The enemy is the blank page. Just put anything down. Don't overthink it. It doesn't even have to. I have plenty of material in from writers that skip. They either skip words or they end a sentence. They don't finish the sentence because they got another thought and they wanted to move on, and they already kind of know how that sentence is going to end. So they skip to the next thing. You can say, skip this chapter, come back later. The point is you get the clay. You need the clay. You just need to create the clay, and then you start the process of sculpting it. And so you just kind of blurt it out, get it all out on the page, and notice, because that can be hard too. It's easy to say, just get it out on the page. That can be really hard too. You sit there and you're, staring at a blank screen. I think writing begets writing. That's another really good nugget. So the more you write, the more you write. And it doesn't have to be brilliant writing. It doesn't have to be even writing for your book. It could be writing, for anything. It could be, so sort of look for any opportunity to write, whether it's in your day job or in a journal or, in any situation that you can, just write. The other thing is read. When you're blocked, a lot of the time it's really helpful to just read the kind of book you want to write, especially because that voice and that rhythm will get in your head and will serve you when you're sitting down later. And it's okay if it sounds a little similar too. If it's getting you going and the rhythm, it's okay to borrow a cadence or a rhythm or a sort of style a little bit from other authors that you like. Whatever you need to do to get yourself going, go, and just give yourself permission to do that. And then also kind of notice what works best for you in terms of when, if you even have the luxury, if you even have that luxury to decide when. Is it when you first wake up? And try out different things. Is it easier for you to say, I'm going to stop when I get to 500 words? Even if I'm in the middle of a sentence, I'm at word 500, I get to stop for the day, close my computer. Some people work that way. Other people like to have a time, just a time, and then if you try doing it with a time, try out different times. Is it 2 hours in the morning? Is it, you wake up, you take a walk, you take a shower, you make breakfast, then you sit down and write for 15 minutes, then you go and do something else and you sit down for 45 minutes. Everybody has a different way that works best for them. And of course, everyone has different circumstances, and that's probably what's going to, in the end, decide what your process is. But just notice when things are flowing well. Just kind of take a second and think, what did I do differently? What are the circumstances that are making this a little bit easier today? And then try to copy that the next time. I had an author who couldn't write when her kids were in the house. Even if she had somebody there, even if she had somebody watching them and she knew and they were not allowed upstairs and she couldn't even hear them, if they were in the house, she couldn't write. She just noticed that one day. So she had to kind of work around that. I think those are some of the most important tips, to just get it all out. I would add one more if I'm not.
Of course, by all means, these are great.
One more is, especially when it comes to memoir, this comes up a lot. People are worried about what other people are going to think if they are going to say something negative about them. So I can't write this about my mother, even though it's true and it's important to the story, or I can't, whatever it is. And that can really kind of cause problems too, because you sometimes you'll sort of notice a hole as you're reading it later, that there is something that would explain or would connect, and it's just somehow not there. So what I always advise people to do about that is to write it in the first draft. You can always go back and take it out later. And if you remove things strategically later, it still reads better, because you still have some of the kind of sentences that link up to it that you always needed, that can stay in because they're not going to, be harmful. And then you can do whatever manipulations or massages or cuttings you have to do later. But the first time you write it, give yourself permission to actually write it. It also unlocks other things for you when you give yourself that permission, knowing that the person who you don't want to see it will never see it.
I love that. All of those were gold.
Yeah.
Starting with the first one, which is just right, because an empty page is very difficult to edit. I think I want to go back to when we were talking about the commercial viability of a book, because I wanted to ask this question about how you balance the creative vision of the author with the commercial realities of the publishing industry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think when you have the time, that's the biggest issue. I mean, if you're talking about when you've already gotten the book, because, for fiction, when you're an in-house editor, you really only buy fiction that's been written, that's complete. So you know what you're buying when you're buying fiction. When you're buying nonfiction, you can buy it on proposal. So it's a little bit more of a question mark what you're going to end up with. And some of the time it's not what you thought. That does happen some of the time. It's not the treatment that you thought it was going to be, or even that the proposal said it was going to be. It ends up being something completely different. So in nonfiction, there's kind of more of that situation where you didn't end up with kind of what you thought you were getting. But fiction, that's less so. You sort of fine tune it, but you know what you're getting. And there's a whole process that happens as an in-house editor before you acquire the book, before you're even allowed to acquire the book. You have to do a P&L, a profit and loss statement. You have to meet with marketing and sales and other editors. You have to pitch the book. Every publishing house has a different kind of song and dance that the editor has to go through in order to get permission to buy the book. And everybody weighs in. And at Amazon Publishing, really everybody weighed in. Editors from other imprints, and basically everybody had to agree that this book was ticked off whatever kind of commercial considerations are there. And you got a lot of people's input. So you didn't have to make that decision on your own. And it could be frustrating because it meant that more often than not, you're told you can't buy the book. but it can also be extremely positive, because when you do get the green light, everybody's on board. Everybody's already on board, and you're kind of all in it together. And so it's also not only your failure, it's kind of the team has made this decision together if it doesn't do well. And so, I guess the commercial considerations have already been hashed out before the book is even bought and ends up on the desk of the editor. So
that makes sense. It's like it's a more collaborative effort than I would have imagined. So that's a great insight into what's going on behind the scenes. The other question I had, so obviously we discussed before we hopped on that you are now an editor, not an editor. We discussed before we hopped on that you are now an agent at large. And one of the things that, at least in my experience working with authors, that gets them really anxious and nervous is the query letter and the querying process. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. And again, what advice would you give an author who's preparing to go down that road?
Definitely. Yeah. So this is something I talk about with people all the time. The most basic thing that a lot of people know already is that you absolutely do need to query agents. It just needs to be short and sweet. Again, it's different for fiction and nonfiction. For nonfiction, you just need the proposal. And that also, there's a very, very kind of standard proposal. And anyone who wants to write a proposal, or even a query letter, which is just about a paragraph, 1 or 2 paragraph in an email to an agent, very short. The Jane Friedman is a really great resource. And I'm sure a lot of people already know about Jane Friedman, because she's kind of janefriedman.com. She has all the resources. She has sample query letters. She has sample proposals. She has links. She has a free newsletter.
Her newsletter is amazing.
She's amazing. She's a really, really, I tell everybody she's the place to start. Just kind of look at her website, and there's a lot of stuff to be learned from her website. But so that's a good place to go to get started. But in general, what you're doing as an agent is kind of the same. I mean, in a way, it's almost the same question you're asking yourself when you then turn it around and work on the proposal to send it to a publisher. When you receive a query as an agent, the first question you're asking yourself is, do I understand what this is? And do I think I can sell it? And that's just one of the things I always like to remind people. At every turn, when you're looking for an agent, when the agent is sending things out to publishers, the author feels like they're being assessed. Their work is being assessed, right? And it is. But the question is not, is this worthy? Is this work worthy of being published? To think that is the question that people are asking themselves is actually giving people in the industry way too much credit, in a way. Nobody is assessing that, because number one, putting aside the question of whether or not it's even possible to assess that, since taste is so subjective, it doesn't matter. This is a business. And so what people are doing is they're saying, in a much more narrow, they're zooming way deeper, way in, and they're just saying, that's what they're saying when they're saying, I'm not the right agent for this, or this doesn't fit our list, or however they phrase it to you in the rejection. What they're really saying is, I don't know how to sell this. I don't know who to sell it to. I personally don't have a vision for how I would present this or package this and get somebody else to figure out how to sell it. So that doesn't mean that someone else doesn't have that vision,
Exactly.
or know the editor who might love it. It means that this agent doesn't. And that's all they're assessing when they look at the query. They're saying, is this a topic that I think is interesting? And do I think it's interesting enough to be able to sell it to someone else? And, or do I happen to know an editor or a house where I think someone would go crazy for this? You know,
That is incredible. What you just said is incredible. One of my most popular posts on Instagram is the rejection one, where I list how many times some really, really prominent authors got rejected, right? And so
wow.
if you gave up, if someone turned around and said, the answer is no, and in your head, instead of thinking, okay, this person just doesn't know how to sell this, I'm going to move on to the next, and you took that as this is not worthy, then we would not have a lot of really fantastic stuff.
Oh, there are so many famous ones. Harry Potter. Harry Potter. She couldn't find an agent for years and years and years. And I think the story goes, I don't know if it's true, but I've heard it enough that it was the child of an agent, and a kind of a small agent after she had tried all the sort of more well-known agents, who read it and said, "Oh, you got to get this," and so they got it. And John Grisham's first novel, he couldn't get it sold. And Lord of the Flies. It's true for classics too. That's one of the famous
I
ones.
I love Lord of the Flies. I'm a big fan.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
imagine if people just gave up. Eventually, and you can make a strategic decision that what you've written or what you're writing, I mean, especially if you're getting feedback from rejections, that is useful, because that's also, sometimes you get feedback that is useful. And if you have another idea, sometimes it's worth exploring the other idea, putting that first one in a drawer, exploring the other idea. And then you never know. There's also a lot of stories about that people then, their second book gets bought. And then once they are known for their second book, or they do well with their second book, they take out their first book and they're able to get that published in a second. So, but this is why it's helpful to have people who can advise you on this kind of thing, and kind of help you think about if there really is something that is insurmountable about the work that you've been trying to submit. And if it is, can you live with the idea of thinking of that as, your MFA or something? Maybe your first book isn't ever going to be sold, but you wrote that, you learned how to write a book with that book. Instead of, going to a master's program, you wrote a book, you actually did it. And that's how you learned how to do it. And then you can move on to something else and succeed
exactly.
there.
You can keep writing, and then maybe you're right. Maybe the second or even the third book. Mindset. I mean, as an author coach myself, what I have to work on with my clients the most is the mindset. There's a lot of emotions. There's a lot of good days and bad days, and there's a lot of constant reminder and just mindset work that goes into this, because people get really attached and wrapped up into it. And sometimes I have authors who publish, and we have a conversation a couple weeks later, and there's a lot of despair over a 3-star review, not even 1-star, 3-star review. So there's a lot of things that authors can take very personally. So I think it's really important to have expectations set correctly, but also, like you said, have certain things be clear. If it's a rejection, this is about a marketing, or viability or commercial viability issue, not about your worth as a person or as a writer, or specifically against your book or your characters or your writing style. It's a business. It's a business, and it's gotten a lot bigger. It's gotten a lot easier. More people are writing. Self-publishing is available. And so it's a lot. Submissions, or, the pile is getting higher and higher. So it is harder it's more competitive, just like anything else nowadays, right? I would love to close with this question, which is, what is the most rewarding aspect for you of being an editor?
It's always been the same thing from whatever side I'm approaching it from. It's working with the author. It's that connection that happens with the author. And kind of most specifically, it's being invited into an author's obsession for a little while, because, anyone who's writing a book is obsessed. That's what writing a book is. You are obsessed with that book, with that material, with that idea. You're thinking about it while you're trying to fall asleep. It's you get ideas in the middle of the day. It's your obsession. And it's just such a kind of joy and privilege to be invited into that obsession for a short time. And it's fun. You get to kind of, you bounce ideas off each other, and you're both kind of equally invigorated by the ideas. It's fun when it's working well. It's because you sort of inspire each other, and it's just really an amazing experience to be able to come in to somebody's world. They let you in, they show you around, you try to help if you can, and then you leave and move on to the next world.
I completely agree. I think it's a great honor and a privilege. And when someone's like, I'm going to let you see my manuscript, I feel so special because you're seeing something that oftentimes they're not allowing even their spouses or their family members or their friends or their coworkers or anybody to see. And it's something that I take very, very seriously. And yeah, it's a whole, I always say, imagine that this something didn't exist until someone thought it up, and then you're allowed into that world as well. And it's really, really cool and really, really rewarding.
Yeah, you're witnessing the process of creation up close. And, you're invited to be there. And only, an author also has to kind of protect themselves. So it is a privilege to be invited to be there in that very vulnerable space with an author as they're doing the world creation.
I agree. Well, thank you so much. The nuggets of information in here for such a short amount of time were incredible. And I'm just so thankful to you for coming on and sharing.
Oh, it's so fun to chat with you. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. For more information on today's episode, please check out the show notes. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the podcast to receive new episodes right when they're released. You can subscribe right now in the app you're using to listen. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Reignite with Nicole. Lastly, I do have a quick favor to ask before we go. If you're enjoying the podcast, I hope you'll let me know by leaving a review. Thank you again for joining me in this episode of Writer Unblocked. I'll see you next time.